In this video I will be recapping the chapter 64 of this manhwa called Revenge of the Iron-Blooded Sword Hound. The swordsman with the iron blood, the owner of Baskerville, one of the 7 families of the great empire, Hugo the Baskerville, the best swordsman in the empire who expelled the barbarians far beyond the borders and also exterminated hundreds of monsters. Once Hugo decided on a direction, he never looked back. He was truly known as a man with iron blood, but now Hugo's feelings began to tremble as he saw the little girl in front of him. Hugo was speechless when he saw the Pomeranian's face. The Pomeranian hugged Vicar with all her strength and tearfully told him that she was very scared, leaving Vicar both shocked and confused at the same time. Tears streaming down her face, the Pomeranian looked at Hugo again, then started crying once more and told Vicar that she was very scared of that man's mustache, leaving Chihuahua speechless. Upon seeing the situation, Vicar quickly intervened and asked his father to calm down. Nervously, he also explained to Hugo that she was a little girl he had personally brought for an errand. He also explained that initially when he saw her red eyes, he thought they were a family trait, but later after investigating he found out that she was from a border tribe. Vicar also told him that there was no chance she was someone known to their family, leaving Hugo speechless. Hugo quickly calmed down, and then put his hand on his head and thought that he had made a mistake since if Penelope were still alive, she couldn't be the same age as the little girl. Hugo stood up and started heading towards the exit, deciding to go back home as he was quite tired. At that moment Vicar looked at him intently and somewhat nervously asked him to be careful. He thought to himself how Hugo, a person with the soul of a sword master, was so surprised to see Pomeranian, so Vicar quickly came to the conclusion that there was definitely something there. Hugo turned around and asked Vicar to attend the grand banquet tomorrow. Upon hearing Hugo's words, Chihuahua was confused and thought to himself that the grand banquet was a dinner where only a very small number of immediate family members gathered. He also thought that the dream of every lower Baskerville was to attend the banquet. Vicar said goodbye to Hugo, telling him that they would see each other tomorrow. Just before leaving through the door, Hugo looked at the Pomeranian once again, who was in Chihuahua's scarred arms. That same night, Vicar placed some pillows on his bed and covered them with sheets while he lay down on the floor next to the bed. With an empty stare, Vicar thought that after washing himself with hot water and lying on the soft bed, he felt uncomfortable and couldn't sleep. He started to wonder if this was due to the influence of the 2 years he had spent with the Balik warriors. He also thought that the influence of the warriors would be ingrained in him for some time. He thought that Hugo's reaction had been quite unexpected. Based on his previous reaction to the incident with the Pomeranian and the amulet, he had to make a decision. After the grand feast tomorrow, he planned to hint to Hugo that Pomeranian might prove to be a good card for him to strike a decisive blow. Either way, he had to do it in a way that wouldn't harm the Pomeranian. Vicar closed his eyes to sleep, but at that moment, the curtain in his room moved. The vicar quickly realized that something was wrong. His senses did not fail him as a hooded woman entered his room. The woman slowly unsheathed her knife and approached Vicar's bed. At that moment, a voice told the woman that less than a day had passed since he had returned, but news traveled fast. Vicar placed one of his hands on the bed and, using the momentum, delivered a powerful kick to the hooded woman. The woman managed to dodge the kick at the last second, but in the process, she dropped her knife, which flew and embedded itself in the wall. In the blink of an eye, Vicar placed his hand under the hooded woman's throat, but at that moment, the woman quickly asked him to wait a minute. She began to tell him that it was just a joke. Upon hearing the woman's voice, Vicar immediately recognized her. Vicar moved closer to the woman's face and asked her to request a formal meeting from now on, as he could have accidentally killed her. The woman replied that sleeping on the floor disguised as a pillow was a strange sleeping habit. The woman slowly started to remove her mask and told Vicar that even if he died and came back to life, nothing had changed about him. After removing the mask, the woman greeted him, and Vicar looked at her and asked her not to cause a scene by calling her by her name, Cindy Wendy. She began to approach the bed and asked Vicar if he had sent her to Chihuahua, and she also asked him how he had known that she was going with the girl who received 10 billion. Vicar, began to put on his shirt and replied that trust was generated by increasing wealth. He also added that he had taken note of her behavior pattern in order to eventually ignore it all. Cindy Wendy sat on the bed and told him that robbing him was rude. She also explained that as a financial planner, the only thing she did was receive unemployment bonuses. She also explained that if it weren't for her, all the $10 billion that Judy received would have been wasted. Vicar denied her words by telling her that bodyguards had been added to prevent that. Cindy Wendy, somewhat confused, asked Vicar if there was no way the bodyguards could do something like that. Vicar revealed to her that financial experts had also been assigned among the bodyguards. He himself had given orders to filter various traders. Cindy Wendy, somewhat surprised, asked if he was referring to those bodyguards. Vicar looked her in the eyes and reminded her that he himself had ordered her to let them get close. She immediately realized that Vicar had been playing with her from beginning to end. As Vicar was fixing his hair, he asked Cindy Wendy what information he had requested. She reached into her suit and pulled out envelopes with information and handed them to Vicar. Seeing this, he thought that her personality hadn't changed much in the past 2 years. He asked Cindy Wendy to place it in the file next time and send it instead of hiding it in her suit. In exchange for this information, Vicar decided to fulfill his promise to build a bridge for trade with the natives. Cindy Wendy replied that from now on she would have to call him boss. As Vicar looked at the envelopes, he thought to himself that these envelopes contained information about the people who would attend the banquet tomorrow. He also thought that since he had made a contribution, he hoped to be invited to the banquet. According to the information in the envelopes, the people who were going to attend the banquet were Hugo Le Baskerville, holding the patriarch rank with the status of Marquis with the military prestige of Swordmaster. Upon seeing Hugo's envelope, Vicar thought that there was no need to check the information about him, but upon opening the following envelopes, he was shocked and asked Cindy Wendy if these people were also going to. The envelopes contained information about Boston Terrier Le Baskerville with the rank of Captain of the Pitbull Knights Senator. With the status of Count, the highest-ranked military prestige according to the information, he was Hugo Le Baskerville's half-brother. He also hated being tied to any place and had a very aggressive and unruly personality. The other envelope contained information about Great Dane Le Baskerville, a captain of the Mastiff Knights and a senator. With the status of Count, the highest-ranked military prestige, he was Hugo Le Baskerville's half-brother. He didn't get along with anyone, but had a particularly bad relationship with the Count, Boston Terrier. Vicar became somewhat confused upon seeing this since these people usually didn't attend family events. He asked Cindy Wendy what was going on. Cindy Wendy replied that they were coming to see the young Baskerville legend who had returned alive. She also assumed they would come to take Vicar to their nightly orders. Vicar started looking at the other envelopes and told her he was sure he would be quite tired tomorrow. Among the envelopes, he saw one that contained information about Osiris Le Baskerville, a representative with the status of Viscount and the highest-ranked military prestige. He was Hugo Le Baskerville's eldest son and was currently the first heir of the family. Upon seeing this, Vicar asked Cindy Wendy if Osiris was also going to attend. She explained that Osiris was the eldest son of the Baskerville family. Growing and replicating Hugo's past, his sword skills were already on par with the 7 counts, and it was estimated that he would soon reach the level of Swordmaster. Vicar thought that before returning, he had seen Osiris several times from afar. He was a quiet and cold person who didn't even greet his subordinates or his younger siblings in the direct lineage. Cindy Wendy asked Vicar if, excluding the patriarch and the 7 counts, Osiris would be the strongest of the Baskervilles. She began to wonder if Vicar was stronger than Osiris. Vicar advised her not to try to guess his fighting power at a glance. Among the information in the envelopes, he saw information about a person who he had heard was receiving training in a closed facility. He started wondering if this person would briefly come out to attend the banquet. This person was Seth Le Baskerville, a consul of the underdog city and a member of the Chamber of Representatives. He held the status of Viscount and had an intermediate-level military prestige. He was Hugo Le Baskerville's second son and was currently the second heir of the family. His talent for sword is. Endling was far behind his elder brothers, and he had been particularly sickly from a young age. His personality was not typical of a Baskerville, as he was gentle and kind. When he was young, Hugo would chase him for being weak. He was the only one who shed tears for the hounds that died like trash. He was the only respectable person in Baskerville. Vicar thought there must be a reason why he had to meet him. After reviewing all the envelopes, Vicar forcefully left them on the table and told Cindy Wendy that these were unexpected names. Cindy Wendy, somewhat confused and angry, explained that she had done a lot of research and also asked why he had rushed to look at them. Vicar simply replied that he knew them better than anyone else. He thought to himself that there would be a great feast tomorrow. He started staring at the envelopes, and with a smile, he told Cindy Wendy that many fun things were going to happen tomorrow. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Hello everyone. In this video I will be recapping the chapter 65 of The Manhwa Revenge of the Iron-Blooded Sword Hound. The next day, Vicar began to make his way toward the grand banquet hall. After several minutes, he arrived at the door of the grand banquet hall, which was guarded by 2 guards who were creating tension in the atmosphere. Vicar started to approach the door and stared at it intently. After several seconds, he began to slowly open the door, further increasing the tension in the room. Upon opening the door, a bright light dazzled his face. Once the intensity of the light subsided, he saw Hugo sitting on the seat of honor. Beside him was his butler. On Hugo's left side sat his children, and on his right side sat his brothers. The butler informed everyone that Vicar van Baskerville was also going to attend the grand banquet as ordered by the head of the family. Everyone turned towards the direction where Vicar was. First, Settler Baskerville turned, who had dark circles under his eyes and looked quite tired, but despite this, he smiled at him pleasantly. Then Osiris turned, who simply looked at Vicar with one eye. Then Highborough, Middleborough and Lowborough turned, who started looking at him with admiration. Then the Great Dane turned around, who was somewhat surprised to see Vicar attending the grand banquet, and finally the Boston Terrier turned around and while resting his head on his fist simply smiled at seeing Vicar. Vicar placed a hand on his chest and closed his eyes to thank Hugo for the invitation to the grand banquet. Hugo stared at him intently, and while his eyes were shining, he called Vicar, son, and asked him to come to the table and sit next to his brothers. He approached and sat at the table, and the grand banquet began. First, everyone started with the main course, which was meat. They all started eating without saying a word, creating tension in the atmosphere. The servant stood behind Boston Terrier's chair and watched as the tension in the room began to increase every second. The first person to break the tension was Boston Terrier Le Baskerville, commander of the Pitbull Order. His plate had 4 pieces of sliced meat. He asked everyone if the meat was undercooked. Hugo became somewhat confused, looked at Boston Terrier and asked him if he didn't like meat. The Boston Terrier smiled and replied that it wasn't what he had meant to say. He then pointed with his hand to the person sitting next to him, who was struggling to cut the meat as it was quite raw. The Boston Terrier explained to Hugo that he was referring to the meat on the plate next to him. The person sitting next to him was Great Dane Le Baskerville, commander of the Mastiff Order, who was a bit annoyed. He asked the Boston Terrier what else he was dissatisfied with. The Boston Terrier stared at him and replied that he had never thought he would eat raw meat. He also added that it was as if he was trying to eat his adorable nephew raw. The Great Dane also stared at him and admitted that Vicar seemed cute, but reminded him that he too was his nephew, and as an uncle, it was natural to guide his nephew on the right path. Boston Terrier pointed his finger at Vicar and asked Great Dane why the right path involved throwing a child to a mastiff. The Great Dane replied that this path was much better than getting involved with a stupid and boring pitbull. While Vicar looked at his uncles, he thought to himself that as expected, they had come with the intention of recruiting him. Among the 7 knights representing Baskerville, 2 of them wanted to recruit him for the Pitbull and Mastiff Knights. Before regressing, Vicar would have liked it since they were the elite with guaranteed success. While he was taking a piece of meat to his mouth, he looked at his uncles disdainfully and thought that now they simply seemed like a bunch of stray dogs. Hugo interrupted the conversation between Great Dane and Boston Terrier. Then while the butler was pouring him some wine and a glass, he explained to them that the younger brothers were always noble and arrogant, and he also added that the head of the house was happy to see them, showing affection for the young master. While Vicar was watching his father drink from the glass of wine, he thought that the chief steward always gave a hopeful interpretation, and he also thought that Hugo enjoyed watching his younger brothers fight. Boston Terrier caught his attention and addressed him as his dear nephew to ask if he had spent the last 2 years in La Rouge at Lenore Mountains. He also asked how many barbarians and monsters he had killed. He asked him to share his forest experiences with him. Great Dane also caught Vicar's attention to tell him that he was also concerned about knowing how his nephew had spent that time in the dangerous forest, and he also added that he was curious about his growth in the forest. Hugo interrupted the conversation and asked his brothers not to pressure him and asked them to let him eat. Great Dane asked Hugo if he felt curious, and Boston Terrier explained that he couldn't resist curiosity, so he hurried back as soon as possible to attend the grand banquet. At that moment, Hugo got angry and asked both of them that it was enough already. Upon hearing this, Great Dane and Boston Terrier felt the immense pressure coming from their older brother's words. Hugo stood up from his chair with a killer aura, and while holding a piece of meat with his fork, he reminded them again that he didn't like to say things twice. Both calmed down and decided to stop talking anymore. But at that moment, Vicar also stood up from his chair, and while looking at his 2 uncles, he explained to everyone that it wasn't difficult to prove his achievements. Upon seeing that Vicar had gotten up, Hugo looked at him and reminded him that he had traveled a long distance. He asked if it wouldn't be exhausting to make it all the way to the drill hall. Vicar looked at Hugo and replied that it was fine. Then he extended his hand and touched the table, explaining to everyone that he could showcase his skills at a time and anywhere. He also asked them if everyday life wasn't an extension of training. He caught the attention of his uncle Boston Terrier and revealed that there was too much wine in his glass. Then he caught the attention of his uncle Great Dane and disclosed that his steak was not well done, leaving both surprised and somewhat confused. While he was touching the table, he began to concentrate, and after several seconds, his fingers started to release a bit of his mana. Vicar directed that mana towards the wine glass and the steak plate, causing the steak to cook perfectly and making sure the wine glass had the perfect amount of wine. The Great Dane pierced the meat with his fork and was impressed to see that it was cooked perfectly. Boston Terrier took the wine glass and, upon seeing that it had the perfect amount of wine, started laughing. Boston Terrier explained to everyone that when Vicar placed his hand on the table, he had used mana to cook the meat and heat the wine. He was surprised to see that he had reached the intermediate level of graduation at 17 years old, when normally one would reach that stage at 33 years old. He also shared his thoughts that his older brother Hugo must feel proud to have a son who had mastered all these techniques. Hugo simply drank from his wine glass and listened to the praises of his younger brother towards his son. Vicar looked towards Highborough, Middleborough and Lowborough and thought that this was very strange because 2 years ago he thought he had revealed his abilities as a mid-ranker graduate when he fought against Madam. He never thought that anyone would know until now. He looked at the 3 boys who were looking at him with admiration and thought they must know about his abilities. He also started to wonder why they didn't inform anyone. At that moment, someone caught his attention by calling him little brother to praise him for working very hard. The person who had praised him was Osiris Le Baskerville, first in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's eldest son. While holding his wine glass, he once again praised Vicar for doing a good job and also asked him to continue working harder in the future. Vicar, somewhat confused, thanked his older brother and began to wonder if Osiris had just praised him. Osiris was the first successor in line for the current Baskerville family and also resembled Hugo the most. Vicar still couldn't believe that Osiris was praising him. He started wondering if he was being evaluated by him. Then another person who had just placed his wine glass on the table told everyone that it was surprising to see the older brother praising his younger brother. This person was Set Le Baskerville, second in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's second oldest son. He looked at Vicar and revealed to everyone that this was the first time he had seen older brother Osiris praise someone with such a bright and joyful smile. He also told Vicar that he had a poker face just like his brother Osiris and asked if by any chance he knew his older brothers. Vicar looked at him somewhat confused and replied that he was very aware of who his brothers were. Set looked at him, and with a joyful smile, he was glad that his younger brother knew him. He then explained that because he was very weak, he always stayed in the medical wing or at the isolation training hall. He also added that his training hall was very close to Underdog where Vicar was deputy consul. He planned to pay him a visit, so he asked if he could share his experience of the deep forests. Vicar, with a lost gaze, looked towards nothingness and thought that his bright attitude, which was very different from being a Baskerville, had not changed. During the fall, Vicar had the opportunity to serve under Set, so there were moments when they were together. In the midst of the chaos of battle, he was the only one who comforted the fallen bloodhounds. He even comforted Vicar, who was soaked in blood wandering through the battlefield. Even when Vicar was falsely accused, he remained by his side defending him until the end. With a cheerful smile, Set told Vicar that he would be under his care. Set was the only person Vicar wanted to meet at this banquet. At that moment, Vicar's expression changed drastically as he began to smell a disgusting stench that had been lingering since before. This repugnant odor was something only he could sense, as it had been present during the fall. This repugnant odor was the smell of demon. He quickly realized there was a hidden demon among the people present at the grand banquet. Vicar looked at everyone and started wondering where the source of this disgusting stench was. He closed his eyes, and after several seconds he opened them again and stared at a person. This person was holding his wine glass. He was Set, who had demon hands covering his body. He stared intently and with a smile asked Vicar, "Is there something you need?" This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
After a few hours, Piggy and the others returned to the academy, and somewhere in the academy was Professor Banshee Morgie's research office. Dollars entered the office, placed her hands on top of the table, and with an angry gaze, began staring intently at the professor, asking why he had not published her article. She had written the truth as it was. She couldn't believe that he had published an article criticizing Night Bloodhound instead of hers. Professor Banshee, who had his hands clasped together, began staring back at her intently, questioning if she was asking this because she didn't know the truth. He explained that her article had been quite offensive to certain groups, reminding her that the Academy maintained a politically neutral stance. Even though she was somewhat furious, she remained silent and listened without interrupting. The professor took out an article from a drawer, placed it on top of the table, and slid it toward her with his hand. This article accused Night Bloodhound of committing terrorism and bringing darkness to the Quo Vadis family. With a serene voice, she mentioned again that she had written the facts as they were. The professor closed his eyes, turned his head to the other side, sighed and argued that her father, Cardinal Humbert, had denied all these facts, and furthermore the leading figures of society who were on the list of indulgences had also declared that the information was not true. Dolores' eyes filled with sadness and distrust. She began to gaze at the ground, explaining that all the information was in the Book of Indulgences. The professor raised his head and with a calm expression responded that the origin of the book was not very clear. Her mind filled with questions, questioning why he was on Quo Vadis' side and if he was being pressured by someone external. The professor's gaze filled with surprise. He went on alert upon seeing that she was getting closer to the truth. He stood up, moved the chair aside using his hand, and began staring at her intently, deciding there was no need to lie. He had been told to focus this article on the terrible act of terrorism committed by the Night Bloodhound, revealing that thanks to her, the dean was also quite perplexed. Upon hearing this, Dolores' expression changed drastically. She started touching her arm out of nerves and began looking at him with a surprised look, not fully understanding what he meant. She remained calm, asking if Cardinal Humbert was so powerful that even the dean of the academy could get into trouble. The professor grabbed his nose and with a confident smile mentioned that if it had only been Cardinal Humbert, there would have been no way for the dean to listen to him in the first place. Dolores' expression turned surprised. She couldn't help but go into shock and realize what was really happening. She began to imagine the Pope of the Church smiling, finally realizing that there was only one person in Quo Vadis who was superior to Cardinal Humbert, and that person was none other than the Pope himself. She placed her hands over her chest and with an empty gaze began to think in silence. Even though everyone else was corrupt, she firmly believed that he was not someone who would lose his integrity. She had heard many people say that his judgment had become a bit blurry as he aged. She didn't know if Cardinal Humbert was taking this opportunity to cover the Pope's eyes and ears from the church. With a serene expression, the professor snapped his fingers and began pointing at her with his finger, arguing that, first of all, her article was not suitable for publication in a newspaper since while reading it, he couldn't help but get the impression that she was secretly siding with the Night Bloodhound, reminding her that he was someone bad who had committed terrorism. Dollars could not avoid feeling internal rage, but even so, she showed no emotion, firmly thinking that the Night Bloodhound was not someone bad, rather the bad ones were Quo Vadis and the demon hiding within the family. The day before leaving, Vicar revealed to her that demons still remained in the world. He had been fighting a difficult battle alone, and there were going to be many more in the future. Today, after speaking with Professor Banshee, she believed she knew why the Night Bloodhound risked his life to kill demons without letting people know. She turned her back to the teacher and started walking towards the door. He began to look at her and asked her not to delve further into this. She opened the door with her hand and promised not to do so, her eyes filled with determination. She also decided to help the Night Hound so that he would not fight alone. Tudor, who was stretching his arms, closed his eyes and concentrated, making his whole body tremble. He started walking next to Sancho, and while stretching his arms due to exhaustion, he explained that it had been a while since he had gone to class. So now he was exhausted. Now he knew why volunteering work was a good option for him. Sancho, who was next to him, began observing him with a confused gaze, thinking that this guy was very strange. In front of them was Piggy, with a cheerful expression. He turned towards Vicar, promising to go together next time. Vicar started walking silently without saying a single word. Tudor approached our boy, placed his hand on his shoulder, and with a kind look mentioned that today he was going to practice Neftali, asking if he wanted to go with them. Vicar didn't even look him in the eyes. With a lost gaze, he replied that he wasn't feeling well and preferred to spend some time alone. Upon hearing this, Tudor's look filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know why Vicar wanted to spend time alone. With a happy expression, Piggy began pointing at himself with his finger, deciding to go to the room with Vicar. Sancho's attention, who was behind them, focused on Piggy. Tudor started covering poor Piggy's mouth with his hand, and with a forced smile, decided to leave Vicar alone since alone time was important. Poor Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a calm and lost expression, our boy thanked them. Some time later, Vicar went to his bedroom and closed the door. He sat in front of the table, and using his hands, he began to open the backpack. He couldn't help but feel calm since that day. He hadn't had time to be alone, and hadn't even been able to organize himself properly. With a lost gaze, he started observing his backpack. The level of swordmaster that he had reached with the blessing of the Saintess had faded because after that day, he had returned to being a supreme graduate. But after all, it had been good for him to experience the level of swordmaster. He reached into the backpack and began rummaging around, and the greatest reward from this fight was what he had obtained while battling against the knights. He took out the masks that Dantalion's guards were carrying. These were leather sacks, and when the 4 sacks came together, they formed a large mask and, according to our boy's memory, this relic was something special. Once the masks were joined, it transformed into a mask with the face of a dog. It was a mask of human faces and from the depths of the heart of rank O, plus called human face in beast form. He would never have thought he would obtain a relic comparable to Beelzebub's demonic sword. He had seen in a book before regressing that it was a mask whose power grew stronger the more it killed its own people. It was said that the more people the user killed, the more powerful it would become, and furthermore, it had an inexplicable level of recovery and aura accumulation. Vikar took the mask out of the backpack and began to observe it with a curious look. He decided to try it on. And despite believing that it was written there were some side effects, for him it was better to take the risk. Without wasting a second, he put on the mask and his eyes became those of a bloodthirsty killer. His resistance and aura, which had been stripped away during the fight with Dantalion, had recovered. Unlike the regenerative abilities of swamp salamanders, which were excellent at regenerating limbs, this mask restored our boy's stamina and fatigue. Vikar now felt that he was in a dark place. He went on alert and his gaze fixed to one side. He felt a strange sensation. Now the table seemed much bigger. Vikar's attention focused on the backpack. He didn't know why his gaze had become so low, and moreover now his vision was in black and white. The reality was that our boy had turned into an adorable dog, and now his clothes were somewhat big on him. Vikar's eyes filled with confusion, realizing that these were the side effects of using the mask. He got down from the chair and started running in circles. If his body didn't return to normal, he was going to be in serious trouble. He had to take off the mask as soon as possible. Little by little, Vikar's method began to take effect, and the mask started coming off. Feeling this, he began to gaze at the ground in confusion. In a matter of seconds, the mask detached from his body, making him return to normal. He began to observe his hand, and his eyes filled with curiosity. If he showed the will to remove the mask, it would come off. The mask fell to the ground, and our boy's attention fixed on it. If the mask had the ability to turn our boy into a dog at any moment he wanted, he realized that it was more of a subability than a side effect. Luckily, there was no rule stating that animals couldn't be kept inside the academy dormitory. Thanks to this, he would be able to use the mask easily here. At that moment, he began to feel a strange energy, his attention fixed on the open backpack that was on top of the table. Vikar became curious, not knowing where this energy was coming from. Our boy put his hand inside the backpack and took out an egg that was hatching. He started observing the egg carefully, placed his hand over his chest, and remembered that this was Madame's egg, and the movement at this moment was a sign of hatching. Previously, while playing, Perry had dropped the egg into the water. The 8-legged Madame was a super high-level monster against whom our boy had almost died several times during their fight. Even for the ancient demons who ruled hell, she was someone difficult to deal with. There also existed a story that monsters like her were guaranteed a space to live in a corner of the depths of the abyss. One of the descendants of this monster was waking up now. At that moment, little by little a small spider began to emerge from the egg. Several seconds later, the egg hatched completely, and out came a small and adorable spider, very different from her mother. With a tender look, the little spider started to look at our boy. Vikar began to observe the spider. He couldn't believe that this little thing resembling a cotton ball was Madame's baby. The little spider began to cry, and upon seeing this, Vikar's mind filled with confusion, but it didn't take him long to realize that this crying was something she had learned from the wolves while the egg was in the deep forest. The little spider's eyes filled with sadness, and then she began to cry and lose strength, and upon seeing this, our boy realized that she was hungry. He took out some meat he had stored in his backpack, broke it into small pieces, and left it on the table. The little spider jumped onto the table and started shaking her body. Vikar began to observe her carefully. He had thought that she ate meat just like her mother, but now he realized that the young ones did not eat meat. The spider climbed back onto Vikar's hand and started to feel dizzy due to hunger. With a calm look, he decided to take this opportunity to raise an S-rank monster from the deep forest, but for now, he needed to find some food. He hid the small spider in his clothes, left his room, and started walking down the hallway. But just as he was about to turn a corner, something caught his attention. Someone asked a commoner not to muddy the waters of the academy. Our boy hid behind the wall and peeked his head around the corner. Several intimidating boys were standing in front of poor Piggy. The boy with the ponytail grabbed Piggy by the shoulder and started to smile, and upon seeing this, poor Piggy couldn't help but panic and start to feel afraid. While on the other side, the man with purple hair who had his arms crossed began to stare at him silently. He was Grenule from Leviathan of the Fire Corps, among the 7 families that represented the Empire. He was from the Leviathan family, an extremely venomous hermit. Vikar had heard that he was the first-year vice president of the Fire Corps and was considered to be the most arrogant person. Piggy began to touch his neck with his hand, and with a forced smile, he turned his back on them and started to walk away, apologizing and explaining that he had just come to the bathroom for a moment and that his friends were waiting for him. At first, they remained silent, but just then, Grenule and his friend appeared in front of Piggy and began to look at him with a piercing gaze. The boy with the ponytail put his hand in front of Grenule, indicating not to act, and with an arrogant expression called Piggy a commoner and asked where he was planning to go. The Grenule approached Piggy and couldn't help but get angry upon seeing that someone with such a simple appearance thought so highly of himself. For him, having to go to the academy with people like Piggy was disgusting, asking if he realized the great insult this represented for someone like him, a descendant of the 7 great families. Piggy's eyes filled with fear, he began looking down at the ground in silence. With an arrogant look, Grenule mentioned that his existence did not fit in this place, asking him to leave the academy. He didn't even want to imagine what Piggy's friends were like, thinking they must be just like him. Upon hearing this, Piggy's gaze turned furious. He could not allow this bastard to insult his friends. Without losing a second, he grabbed Grenule by the collar, and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly in rage, as he couldn't believe that a commoner was doing this. Fury consumed Piggy's mind, and with a piercing look, he made it clear that he didn't care if they spoke like that about him. But he wasn't going to let anyone insult his friends. Grenule began observing Piggy's behavior in silence, and then veins appeared on his face. With an enraged gaze, he asked if Piggy really thought he'd leave him alone after this. Using his hand, he pushed Piggy back, turned to his friend, and gave the order to crush him. Upon hearing this order, his friend clenched his fist and prepared to strike. Piggy closed his eyes and braced himself for the blow, but several seconds passed, and he was never hit by it. Consumed by curiosity, he began to open his eyes. It was Tudor who had blocked the attack from Grenule's subordinate. He turned to Piggy and with a worried look asked if he was okay. At that moment, someone muscular placed his hand on top of the head of Grenule's other friend, causing the boy to panic, not knowing what was happening. It was Sancho. He grabbed the boy's head firmly, and his eyes filled with rage, revealing that if what they wanted was a test of strength, they had chosen the wrong opponent. The boy began to scream in pain. Seeing this, Piggy's eyes filled with surprise. He couldn't believe that Tudor and Sancho were defending him. Piggy fell to the ground, and at that moment Vikar appeared behind him and placed his hands on his shoulders to help him stand up. Upon seeing Vikar, Piggy couldn't help but be left speechless. He couldn't believe that even Vikar had come to defend him. Upon seeing Tudor, Grenule couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly, and his eyes filled with rage. Tudor, Sancho, and Vikar stood next to Piggy with a piercing expression. Tudor finally realized why Piggy was taking so long to return. Sancho began staring intently at Grenule, and Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. Tudor's eyes filled with rage. He couldn't believe that Grenouille had dared to touch his friend. Piggy panicked upon hearing this. Sancho started cracking his fingers and began showing a piercing expression, ready to fight, while on the other side, our boy showed no emotion. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, while the sunlight was entering the hallway through the window, Tudor clenched his fists and began to look at the floor in silence. Sancho crossed his arms without making a move. Piggy and Vicar remained silent, creating tension in the atmosphere. Granol started staring at them with an arrogant gaze and with a smile mentioned that they said you could know a person's level by looking at the people they hung out with, and by looking at his plebeian friends he could see Tudor's level. Despite having his mind full of rage, Tudor tried to stay calm, and with a piercing look asked if he had forgotten that he had taught him that there was no distinction between nobles and plebeians in the academy. The Granol extended his hand to the side and mocked him by asking what he was doing, frowning, revealing that he was just someone who had been at the scene of the night bloodhound incident, but had not been able to do anything. Sancho's eyes, as he stood with his arms crossed, filled with confusion, not knowing how this guy knew this. Tudor's expression changed from rage to surprise. With a serene look, he responded that he hadn't been able to do anything because he was sleeping at that moment. The eyes of Granol's subordinates filled with fury, and they began putting on masks. He placed his hand over his chest, and his body started releasing a toxic gas. He stared intently at Tudor and, with an arrogant smile, said that losers always had excuses. If he had been there, he would have caught the night bloodhound. In the blink of an eye, his body began to release a large amount of toxic gas, which started spreading throughout the room. Seeing this, Piggy's eyes filled with fear since he didn't know what was happening. Tudor, who was standing nearby, began observing Granol and couldn't help but go on alert without knowing what this guy was planning to do. He put his arm in front of his mouth and his eyes filled with fear and surprise, asking if Granol intended to show his skills inside the academy. Vicar, who was behind, began to observe the gas, and it didn't take long for him to realize that it was paralyzing poison. At that moment, the small spider emerged from our boy's clothes and her attention fixed on the gas. Upon feeling her touch, Vicar couldn't help but fall into confusion without knowing what was happening. In the blink of an eye, the entire room filled with gas. Granol, whose eyes were full of rage, put his hand in front of his face and with a piercing gaze revealed that he was only playing. He was merely demonstrating the difference in level between them and him. His subordinates, who were wearing masks and standing behind him, began to show a piercing gaze, ready to attack. Granol wanted them to feel the difference in status and despair. Piggy started covering his mouth with both hands. Sancho began pinching his nose with his finger, and his attention fixed on Granol without knowing what this guy was planning to do. Tudor's eyes, who had his arm in front of his face, filled with worry, making him clench his teeth tightly, realizing that this was not good. The little spider, who was hungry, opened her mouth and prepared to eat. At that moment, she began to devour the paralyzing poison that was in the room. Our boy was in shock without knowing what was happening. The little spider was devouring the gas so quickly that Tudor closed his eyes. Vicar started watching her with a surprised expression. He couldn't believe that Madamai's offspring was rapidly inhaling the poisonous mist. To prevent her from being discovered by the others, Vicar grabbed her with his hand, and he soon realized that her staple food was eating poison. Tudor, who thought he was going to die, opened his eyes, and his gaze filled with surprise and confusion upon seeing what was happening. In the blink of an eye, the little spider devoured all the poisonous mist. Now the room looked as if nothing had happened. Tudor, Sancho, and Piggy were somewhat confused, not knowing what had just occurred. Tudor had been scared for no reason, but luckily Granol also had common sense. Granol's subordinates were in shock and couldn't help but feel fear upon seeing that the poisonous mist had disappeared without a trace. Granol's eyes filled with surprise and confusion. He could not avoid going into shock and starting to sweat without knowing what had just happened. Vikar hid the little spider back inside his clothes, and she started burping, causing a bit of venom to come out through our boy's collar. He quickly looked away to avoid drawing attention. Granol's gaze fixed on him. He felt as if all the fog had been absorbed by our boy. He didn't know if he had seen wrong. He crossed his arms, closed his eyes, and a smile spread across his face. He had shown a generosity deeper than the abyss, and it was a waste of poison to use it on idiots from the ice core who were full of muscles instead of brains. Tudor began to walk toward him, and with a serene expression explained that he knew that he had been looking down on them for a long time. He approached, clenched his fist tightly, and began to stare him straight in the eyes with a piercing gaze, asking if he didn't want to fight under fair conditions. Granol's eyes filled with seriousness. He returned the gaze and began to think silently, with a gaze full of rage. Tudor mentioned that the midterm team competition was about to take place, and the team with the lowest score would have to run a lap around the academy naked. The Granol remained calm and accepted with a serene expression. His eyes filled with excitement as he turned around, started waving goodbye to them, and with an arrogant smile accepted the bet, because he believed it would be good training to see how they were going to lose. While little by little he was moving away, Tudor stayed watching in silence, eagerly waiting for the day of the competition. Piggy, whose mind was full of guilt, approached, started looking at the ground, and with a sad gaze, asked for forgiveness. Upon hearing this, Tudor came out of his trance and with a calm expression explained that everything had gone well since he was going to crush Granol's ego. Piggy's eyes filled with tears. He was just a low-ranking expert, so he didn't know if he would be of any help during the competition. With a kind smile, Tudor placed his hand on Piggy's shoulder and told him not to worry since he was somewhat intelligent and had excellent observation skills. Everyone started walking down the hallway, and along the way, Tudor extended his hand and with a cheerful smile explained that since they were going to be 4 in the midterm team competition, Sancho and he would be the vanguard, Piggy would be the middle commander, and Vikir, who specialized in bows, would take care of the rear guard. Therefore, achieving a high score was going to be a piece of cake. Upon hearing this, Piggy's eyes filled with excitement, bringing a smile to his face. Sancho began observing Piggy, and upon seeing his smile, he couldn't help but feel inner peace. Meanwhile, on the other side, our boy remained silent. They were not willing to lose against someone like Granol. Piggy clenched his fists and couldn't help but smile. His eyes were full of determination and admiration, but Vikir broke his smile. He raised his hand and with a cold expression explained that he already had a friend with whom he had decided to form a team for the team competition, so he was not going to be part of their team. Tudor went into shock, turned around, and with a surprised expression started asking why. Vikir began pointing towards the ceiling with his finger and repeated again that he had a friend with whom he had decided to form a team. Piggy panicked, extended his hands to the sides, and with a confused gaze asked if Vikir couldn't reject him, to which he replied that promises were important. Everyone got mad at Vikir since they wanted him to pay attention to the situation. If they lost, they would have to run naked through the academy. Vikir showed no emotion, looked away, and said nothing. A week later, it was a wonderful day. The sun was shining high in the sky. All the students of the academy went to the stadium. The eyes of the students were full of excitement, and everyone was eager for the competition to begin. Several students emerged from the door. It was Tudor's team. There was a man carrying a shield, a woman carrying a staff, and another man carrying a crossbow. Everyone started cheering for her, since she was the pride of the imperial capital. Tudor's eyes were full of emotion and seriousness once she entered the field. A blue barrier appeared around her body. The partial exams of Colosio Academy were open to the public. There were a total of 3 subjects for the partial exam. The first team test that served to evaluate defense. The second individual test to evaluate offensive strength, And lastly, there was the written test where every year many students struggled to pass. In the defense test that was going to take place today, a dungeon was created in the stadium using holographic magic, in which they were going to have to fight against fictional monsters created by applying holographic magic to a clay golem. The magic began to take effect, and in the blink of an eye, giant ants made of clay emerged from the ground. The man carrying the giant shield was the team's tank. He stood at the front to block attacks. Dollars positioned herself behind him, closed her eyes, extended her hands, and began using her power. The boy carrying a crossbow prepared to attack, while the girl holding the magic staff summoned a fireball and got ready for long-range combat. The magic shield was going to cover the entire body of the students, and when they received a certain amount of impacts, the damage taken would be displayed on a distant panel. The students formed a team of 4 to defend themselves from the wave of monsters approaching, and the test performance was measured by their contribution and how long they managed to resist. The fight began, and Dollars summoned a large magic circle behind them. The HP points granted to the students were deducted each time they were hit by monsters, and when their HP points reached 0, the test would automatically end. There were 3 rounds, 20 minutes each. If one survived a total of 60 minutes, they would achieve a perfect score. The audience began to cheer her team with excitement, and the best grade of this term had come from the third-year students, more precisely from the team of the school president, Dollars, who had managed to endure for 58 minutes, achieving the best record among the third-year students. Her team members were sitting and exhausted. Dollars was the only one still standing, but had all her clothes full of scratches. With a tired gaze, she began to pant heavily. Somewhere else was Piggy, who was writing something in a notebook with a surprised expression. He realized that the fourth-year students were not taking the test. He was sure that Dollar Senior's team would be the best team and would achieve the highest score on the midterm test. Behind him was Sancho, who had his arms crossed and carried an axe on his back. Next to him was Tudor, who carried a spear. Piggy, who was jotting down notes in the notebook, mentioned that generally third-year students reach the third round and second-year students reach the second round, so they, as first years, if they could last 20 minutes, would be at the top. With a smile, Tudor replied that they couldn't be satisfied with that. He began observing the competition with a cheerful expression and explained that if they wanted to crush Granule's ego, they needed to at least make it halfway through the second round. Sancho also started enjoying the competition with a smile. At that moment, someone with their hand on their hip appeared and explained that she was going to be with them, so it wouldn't be a problem anymore. Upon hearing this, their attention turned to her. It was Bianca, who carried a bow as her weapon. She began walking toward them, and, while touching her hair with her hand, asked Tudor to make sure he played his role well so the monsters wouldn't focus on her. With a confident smile, she revealed that she was going to hunt all the monsters. Tudor's eyes filled with insecurity. He didn't know whether to trust her. With a calm expression, he mentioned that teamwork wasn't about being a princess and having 3 servants. He would have to strip if he lost, so he asked her to take it seriously. A smile appeared on her face as she mocked him by saying that she didn't want to see him naked either, since her eyes would rot. She then urged him to give his best effort. Sancho kept calm and did not lose his composure. With a serious expression, he explained that they were going to have to fight against the enemy on the battlefield. Tudor and Bianca turned their backs on each other, Piggy's eyes filled with confusion, and it didn't take him long to realize that Tudor and Bianca were secretly on bad terms. His attention fixed on the sky and his mind filled with many questions, not knowing why Vicar had gone to another team. Somewhere else in the stadium was our boy. With a serious look, he mentioned again that he didn't like people noticing him. He carried a bow on his back. Vicar crossed his arms and with a serious expression explained that things had happened and he had received some attention, so it would be bad if he got more than this. So, he gave permission to the other members of his team to go crazy so that he wouldn't have to do anything. In front of him were 3 boys with blonde hair. They were the triplets, who promised to protect Vikar so that he wouldn't have to do anything. The eyes of Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough were full of excitement, and a smile spread across their faces. Their attention was fixed on Vikar, and they couldn't help but blush. It was the first mission their master had given them, so they had to do it well. While Tudor, Sancho, and Piggy were waiting bored to death, someone wearing white boots appeared and caught their attention. They knew that Tudor had abandoned his plebeian friend and taken Bianca from the Usher family, being a natural decision to make in order to win. Granwell was a second-year student. With a confident smile, he was sure it would be impossible for them to win. But he was also a little annoyed since they had also recruited someone new to the team. Someone with white hair asked him if he could stop smiling sinisterly. Somewhat annoyed, Granwell turned around and, with an angry expression, mentioned that she should be grateful for being accepted, calling her a commoner. It was Sinclair? She clenched her fist and with a surprised gaze responded that she didn't feel like it, but as teammates they were going to work hard to improve each other's grades. She put her hand on her chin and couldn't properly say Granwell's name, something that made him angry. She started looking around, not knowing where Vikar was. Granwell's subordinates began to observe her and thought she was someone very strange. His eyes were full of confidence. He firmly believed that the first place among the first-year students belonged to them. They were Team 69. Vikar's team was Team 108. Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough carried swords as weapons while our boy carried a bow. Tudor's team was Team 109. While Bianca was waving at the audience with her hand, Tudor started cracking his fingers and with a confident smile decided it was time to begin. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the audience went wild and all the students began cheering for their favorite teams. Once a team entered the arena, a blue barrier appeared around the ring to prevent monsters from escaping and attacking the spectators. Vikir, who was waiting for his turn with a lost gaze, started looking at the ground since he didn't remember seeing the academy exam in his previous life. He only knew one needed to fight but didn't expect to do so against monsters. Highbrow, who was standing next to him, noticed this and the 3 brothers were somewhat surprised, not knowing why Vikir was so deep in thought. With a kind smile, Highbrow extended his hand toward our boy and, seeing that he had no information about the exam, explained that upon entering the stadium, the virtual reality magic circle was activated, and the surroundings turned into something like a dungeon. When monsters swarmed in masses, the exam began. Inside the stadium, a horde of mud ants emerged, releasing a curtain of poisonous gas. The students who were fighting covered their noses to avoid inhaling the smoke and dying. The rules were simple. One only had to endure as long as possible until their HP dropped to 0. The poison released by the monsters was diluted real poison. So even if one didn't receive a physical attack, they had to be careful with the poison, since it could continue consuming their HP points. Upon hearing this, Vikir came out of his trance, turned around, and with a serene expression asked if they were really using poison. Highbrow mentioned that he had heard that when an accident occurred, the academy instructors deactivated magic and then intervened. Vikir realized that they knew a lot, so he asked if they had ever practiced before. With a smile, Middleborough admitted that when Vikir was away from the family home, they had practiced several times at the family training center. Vikir's eyes widened with excitement and with a kind smile. He decided to leave this in the hands of the triplets. They should run as wildly as they wanted so that Vikir wouldn't have to move. Upon hearing this order, the triplets couldn't help but clench their fists and feel admiration for our boy. With an excited smile, they swore to protect him firmly. This was the first mission given by the master, so they had to do it well. While they were talking, Tudor and the others arrived at the area. He began waving his hand and caught Vikir's attention. Our boy snapped out of his trance and turned toward them. With a kind smile, Piggy started greeting our boy, while on the other side, Sancho, who had his arms crossed, began showing a cheerful smile. Tutor began to touch his head with his hand and, with a nervous expression, realized that Vikir had prepared well for the exam. He approached our boy, put his hand near his mouth, and with a calm gaze explained that he would never have thought that Vikir would associate himself with the Baskerville triplets, questioning if he was really okay. Upon hearing this, the triplets couldn't help but feel furious, creating tension in the atmosphere. Vikir did not lose composure and responded that he had formed a group together not because they had forced him to do so, but because it had truly been a prior agreement. Tutor's eyes filled with confusion and concern, asking if this was true. Vikir didn't even look him in the eyes, and replied that a few weeks ago they had asked him for help to learn more about the monsters. Tutor thought they were intimidating Vikir, but he refuted this idea, explaining that he was fine. Piggy's attention was fixed on the sky as the virtual magic barrier had disappeared, leaving him somewhat surprised. In the stadium were the corpses of mud ants, and in the middle were 3 students who were somewhat injured and exhausted. They were Team 68 of first year. It was the turn of Team 69 from the first year to come to the stadium. A confident smile spread across Granville's face as it was his team's turn. With a confident expression, he began walking toward the stadium and decided to show what they were capable of. The 2 men couldn't help but smile, while on the other side Sinclair started following them. She was excited. Once they entered the stadium, fierce mud ants appeared and began roaring. The virtual magic barrier was activated, causing the ants to charge against Granville's team. He activated his power, making a magic circle appear which began to release poisonous gas. Seeing that the ants were ready to attack, he couldn't help but go on alert. He turned around and asked Sinclair if she was ready. She extended her hands, closed her eyes and concentrated, making a magic circle appear behind her. Sinclair opened her eyes and with a serious expression began to use her power. The magic circle began to release energy which started to concentrate in front of her. The glow became intense and her gaze fixed on it. Her eyes were full of determination. She wanted to show the world what she was capable of. Several ants charged at her, but just then she stomped hard on the ground and counter-attacked, causing the bodies of the ants to be flung backward. Upon seeing this, the audience couldn't help but go wild, and everyone started cheering for her. Her power even caught Vikar's attention. He raised his head and his gaze fixed on her. The combat was fierce, so she began to invoke another spell and prepared to attack again. There was a reason why she was in the first place. With that level of skill, she would have become a famous mage in the future. However, there were no records of her in the era of destruction. A while later, the exam for Team 69 of the first year ended, and the virtual magic barrier was Granville, who had his hands on his hips and whose men were exhausted. Sinclair was lying on the ground with her clothes full of scratches. She began to wipe the sweat from her forehead with her hand and sighed, as the exam had been difficult. According to the results, they had set a new record with 19 minutes and 55 seconds, being the highest time among first-year students. Seeing this, Tutor couldn't help but clench his fists and feel frustrated, his eyes filled with rage. He was furious to see that the bastard Granule had achieved a new first-year record. Despite being somewhat surprised, Sancho and Piggy remained silently watching without saying anything. At that moment, Tutor's eyes widened in surprise as something caught his attention. It was Granule, while he had one hand resting on his waist. He began to point at Tutor with the finger of the other and with an evil smile said that he couldn't wait to see him run naked. Seeing his expression, Tutor, Sancho, and Piggy couldn't help but get angry and clenched their teeth tightly. Their eyes were full of rage and they swore not to lose against him. At the same time, someone wearing white boots descended into the stadium. It was Team 108, Vikar's team. While our boy was walking calmly, the triplets moved ahead, started observing their surroundings and couldn't help but smile. The 3 were excited since their master had entrusted them with a mission. Once Vikar entered the stadium, Tutor, who was among the crowd, placed his hands near his mouth and began cheering him on with a smile. Meanwhile, on the other side, Piggy started waving his hand, saying that they trusted him. Our boy simply kept walking without paying attention. He was more focused on what was about to happen next. The triplets became serious and filled with determination since they wanted to take the first place for Vikar. The mud ants emerged from the cave. their piercing gazes fixed on Vikar and the others. Bianca, who had her arms crossed, was somewhat confused. She began observing Vikar and asked what was happening to him. Piggy's attention focused on her, his eyes filled with surprise and confusion as he did not know what she was referring to. A shield appeared around Vikar's body. With a calm attitude, he drew the bow and grabbed an arrow. Bianca couldn't believe that he was going to use a bow. Piggy explained that Vikar had registered the bow as his main weapon in the Ice Corps. The ants prepared to attack, and upon seeing this, Vikar also prepared to shoot the bow. Bianca and the others wanted to see how well he handled the bow. In the blink of an eye, our boy shot a barrage of arrows at the monsters. Bianca was speechless. Piggy was open-mouthed and surprised at how fast he was. Bianca's eyes filled with fear, and her attention fixed on Vikar. She didn't know what that rapid fire was. Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough drew their swords and began to fight against the ants. Vikar was behind them, shooting arrows. Even though he was fast, his power was weak, and he also lacked precision since once the arrows reached the ants, they lost a lot of speed. Vikar prepared to attack again, but at that moment he began to feel a sense of unease. He froze for several seconds, and his eyes started to shine with seriousness as he began thinking silently. The tip of the arrow began to shine, and not long after, Vikar released his powerful mana and enveloped the tip with it. He knew he was giving a bad impression, so he attacked again, and the mana arrow struck an ant, destroying its body into pieces. Highborough stood in front of Vikar, and with a serious expression prepared to defend him from the ant's attacks. Vikar began to gaze at the ground. If he didn't hide his abilities, it was going to be a nuisance, but it was uncomfortable for him not being able to show his abilities. He began to remember what his friend from the tribe had told him. She clenched her fist and with a furious gaze promised not to let Vikar go if he went somewhere and didn't give everything he had. His eyes filled with joy, bringing a smile to his face. He apologized for not being able to keep his promise. The little spider emerged from his clothes and began to show a tender expression. Vikar's attention fixed on her. With a determined smile, he decided it was time to let her act. The corpse of the mud ants began to release poisonous gas. The small spider descended from Vikar's shoulder and started bouncing on the ground. Her eyes filled with happiness, she couldn't help but feel joyful at seeing food. Without wasting a second, she began to absorb the poison. Vikar turned his back to her and started observing in silence. He had heard that the poison came from the ants. He assumed this place was no different from a buffet for the baby spider, so he decided to let her have fun until the exam was over. Several minutes passed and the virtual magic barrier did not disappear, and Vikar and the others continued fighting. Some time later, the exam of Team 108 came to an end. Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough fell to their knees on the ground due to exhaustion, while on the other side, Vikar was standing and not at all tired. They had managed to endure 19 minutes and 50 seconds, obtaining second place among the first-year students. A smug smile appeared on Granwell's face and his eyes began to shine with confidence. He started laughing like a madman since no one could beat his team's record. He and his friends started laughing, pointing at Vikar with his finger. He said there was no way a commoner could defeat him, revealing that this was the difference in rank between them. Sinclair, who had her arms behind her back, began to show a forced smile, thinking that phrase sounded like something from a third-rate villain. Consumed by humiliation, Highborough, Middleborough, and Lowborough stood up and placed their swords on their necks. They were sad and thought that the crime of not giving first place to Vikar was decapitation. However, Vikar, who was somewhat confused, turned around and gave them the order to stop since the second place was also too high. It was team number 109's turn to enter the stadium. The doors opened. Sancho, who carried an axe on his back, mentioned that Vikar had obtained second place. Tiggy, who was next to him, thought it was an achievement worth celebrating. Tudor prepared to enter the stadium. The team entered the stadium. Bianca closed her eyes and with a smile began waving her hand. Tiggy couldn't help but feel nervous seeing so many people, while on the other side Sancho started showing a calm smile. Tudor's eyes filled with emotion, bringing a smile to his face, to defeat Granol, who held the record of 19 minutes and 55 seconds. They had to achieve a better time. A mud ant opened its mouth and lunged at them. But Tudor drew the spear and attacked the monster's head, shattering it into pieces without much effort. Bianca drew her bow and began attacking from a distance. Tiggy was the captain and was giving orders. Tudor, who wielded a spear, was on defense, and Sancho, who was the tank, stood in front massacring the monsters with his axe. Vicar began to observe and his eyes filled with surprise. Tudor and Sancho were fighting against the monsters at the vanguard. Bianca was attacking from behind with the bow, and Tiggy was pointing at the monsters with his finger. He was a lieutenant who observed all the situations and gave instructions. Our boy crossed his arms and realized that, judging by their good teamwork, they had prepared a lot, and he believed they could obtain first place. Vicar began to touch his neck with his hand as he felt a sense of emptiness. He placed his hand over the collar and couldn't help but go on alert, his eyes filled with fear upon realizing what was happening. His eyes widened in surprise and panic. In front of him there was a corpse of one of the ants. His attention fixed on the corpse, and upon looking with a bit of attention, he saw that there was something small on top of the monster's head. It was the little spider. She opened her mouth and began to absorb the venom from the corpse. She was happy and her eyes were shining with excitement and joy. Our boy did not know what she was doing in the stadium. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the little spider descended from the ant's corpse, opened her mouth, and began inhaling all the poisonous gas that the beast's corpse was releasing. Seeing this, Vicar's eyes filled with rage and concern, causing him to clench his teeth tightly and tense up. He was furious because he remembered having kept her in his pocket after finishing the exam. He did not expect that the small creature would be unable to resist the desire to consume poison and run off. Behind the little spider was her old skin. She opened her mouth and, with a hungry gaze, began devouring all the poison in the area. Seeing that she had shed her skin in such a short time showed that her growth speed was extraordinary, something common since, after all, she was Madam's baby. A virtual barrier appeared around the stadium, and Tudor's team began to fight against the ants. Now they were surrounded on all sides. Vicar started watching without being able to do anything, knowing that now there was nothing that could be done with the baby spider since they were in the middle of the exam. Tudor gripped the spear tightly, making a powerful blue-colored mana appear. Now, the only thing our boy could do was wait for the exam to end so as not to cause problems. An ant tried to attack Tudor, but he moved at great speed and with a determined gaze attacked the beast, piercing its body into pieces as if it were a balloon. While the pieces of the beast's body were falling to the ground, Tudor rested the spear on his shoulder, and his eyes filled with joy. He placed his hand on his waist and began to show a confident smile. Bianca, who was behind him, closed her eyes and with a confused and somewhat annoyed expression mentioned that Tudor was wasting energy that didn't need to be used, questioning whether it was really necessary to cut the ants into pieces. Upon hearing Bianca's irritating voice, Tudor's smile disappeared. He began staring at her with an angry gaze and clenched his teeth, thinking she was very annoying. With a confident gaze, Bianca prepared to shoot the bow, and with an arrogant smile mentioned that Tudor couldn't even control himself. There was nothing she could do for him, so she decided to show him how things were done. While they were talking, an ant started charging toward them. But just then, Bianca began releasing mana and launched a powerful arrow imbued with mana toward the beast at great speed, her arrow cutting through the air as if it were a fighter jet. Just before the poor ant had time to react, in the blink of an eye, the arrow lodged into its head, causing it to start screaming in agony. Upon seeing this, Tudor decided not to stand idly by. He started running towards the ants, turned around and with a competitive smile explained that although she was doing well, he couldn't lose. Bianca's eyes filled with excitement. She prepared to shoot another arrow, and with a smile asked him to try to keep up with her pace. Using the giant axe, Sancho cut an ant's head in half. The atmosphere became somewhat competitive. Tudor, Bianca and Piggy began fighting against the ants. Sancho, who was in front of her, turned around and his mind filled with confusion. He didn't know if those two really got along or not. Piggy decided to take a step forward. He put his hand near his mouth, and with a serious expression revealed that the ranks were disorganized, asking everyone to stop for a moment to organize them again. Now there were a lot of corpses in the area, and the poison was spreading more and more through the air. Everyone heard the order and stopped attacking to pay attention to Piggy. He extended his hands and told Bianca that she didn't have to kill. He believed it would be better for her to aim at the joints of the front legs as much as possible. He also pointed out Tudor's mistake, mentioning that it was effective to attack when the ants' ranks were broken. He also advised Sancho that instead of blocking in the center, he should try to push a little more. They decided to follow Piggy's orders and began following his instructions. Tudor started to smile and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised since Piggy was craftier than he had imagined. Sancho, who was running by his side, also began to show a cheerful smile, explaining that Piggy was a warrior after all. Upon feeling these praises, little Piggy couldn't help but feel somewhat embarrassed and happy at the same time. With a nervous expression, he explained that he didn't want to cause trouble, but he was happy since his research had been worth it. Sancho's eyes filled with emotion. He gripped the axe tightly and charged at the beasts. An ant tried to attack by surprise, but with a confident smile, Tudor blocked the attack using the spear. Piggy, who was behind him, extended his hand and began pointing out the weak spots of the beasts. While on the other side Bianca started shooting at the ants' joints with her bow. They firmly believed that this team could break a new record. A few minutes passed and now there were even more mud ant corpses on the ground, with the poisonous gas spreading through the air. The exam of team number 109 came to an end. They managed to endure 19 minutes and 55 seconds, tying for first place among the first-year students. While Piggy was exhausted and sitting on the ground, Tudor had his hands resting on his knees and was somewhat tired, while on the other side, Sancho and Bianca were standing and were the ones with the most physical endurance. Granel, who was among the audience, clenched his fists and teeth tightly, and his eyes filled with rage, as he could not believe that Tudor's team had lasted the same amount of time as them. His friends were in shock, unable to believe that they had managed to endure so much. Consumed by depression, Bianca turned her back on everyone, sat down, and with a lost gaze began lamenting for having tied in first place. Piggy, who was panting heavily and exhausted, couldn't help but feel somewhat furious because if only they had held on 1 second longer, they would have taken first place. Tudor, who was wiping the sweat from his chin with his hand, stood up and began to feel worried since he knew that now he would have to run naked. With a disappointed expression, Bianca started touching the HP shield. The fact that her HP had dropped to 0 meant that if this had been a real battle, she would already be dead. Sancho turned toward Tudor and with an excited smile swore to one day become a warrior who could last an hour like President Dollars. Upon hearing this, a smile spread across Tudor's face. He decided it was time to leave this place. Dollars, who was sitting among the audience, couldn't help but smile and feel proud. Although they were her juniors, they were all incredible. She didn't know how they would grow in the future. Phase 1 of the exam ended, and these were only monsters for first-year students. Phase 2 began, and from now on, these monsters were only for second-year students. The eyes of Dollars filled with surprise upon seeing what had appeared in front of her. A horde of mud ants began to emerge from the cave, much more powerful than the previous ones. The attention of our boy fixed on the ants and his eyes filled with fear. He did not know what was happening. Even Granville clenched his teeth and could not avoid being afraid. No one knew what was happening. While Tudor's team was about to leave the stadium, the ants began to surround them. They couldn't help but panic, not knowing why the ants were coming back if the exam had ended. Their gaze fixed on the ants, they tensed up and couldn't avoid feeling fear. And even though Tudor didn't know what was happening, he asked the others to be careful since any injuries they received from now on would be real. Sancho clenched his teeth, knowing that if the ants attacked, they would die. The powerful mud ants rose and prepared to attack. Sancho and Tudor drew their weapons, adopted a defensive stance, and got ready to fight. They had no choice but to wait until the academy responded. Somewhere in the city, there was the magical control room. All the staff inside were in panic. They were monitoring and controlling everything that was happening in the stadium. The students' HP points were at 0, but the exam had not yet ended. They were first-year students, and no one knew why Phase 2 had been activated. Even if they excluded the students from the exam room, the strong life reaction would remain, so it seemed that an error had occurred. One of the men holding a tablet mentioned that if the suit's HP points reached 0, it should be normal if there was no vital reaction. However, data showed there was a being full of vital force capable of fighting a battle. The attention of the man with a mustache fixed on the tablet and his eyes filled with surprise. Just then, Dollars entered the room running. She extended her hand to one side and with a worried gaze revealed that there was a problem with the exam. Upon hearing this, everyone turned around and their attention focused on her. She asked them to please rescue the students who were inside as soon as possible. The bodies of the teachers began to tremble. They remained silent, not knowing what to say or what to do now. Everyone looked away inside. The long-haired teacher turned towards them, and with a sincere gaze explained that they were only a pattern management department, and checking vital responses was not their responsibility. Dollars was in shock, not knowing what to do now. The teachers began to talk among themselves. One of them revealed that it would be faster to stop the golems than to write and solve the code of the magic circle. Another teacher thought he was right since from this year on, the creation and movement of the golems were automated. With an indecisive gaze, the man mentioned that the code of the magic circle related to this was also linked to the magic stone, and permission from above was required to dismantle it. Furthermore, even if they dismantled the magic circle, there would still remain dealing with the magic wall, and dismantling the magic wall required a key. Upon hearing this, Dollar's eyes filled with fear and despair, thinking that Tudor and the others were going to die. The teachers knew that even if they had a key for the magic wall, it was impossible to dismantle it with just one key. She couldn't help but clench her teeth tightly and feel desperate. Mother Sadie, who had the B key, had said she was going to the bathroom and they had lost contact. Vikar was sitting on one of the stadium windows, worried about the little spider and the others. He remained calm and with a tranquil expression began to wonder if there was some error with the magical device. When he had taken the test, no vital reaction had been detected. It didn't take him long to realize that this could only mean that the baby spider had grown after eating poison, and it had been affected by the life detection of the magic stone. His attention fixed on the magical barrier. He started observing carefully and thought this must be an error. He noticed that the fog had begun to increase. If he didn't hurry, someone was going to get hurt. Then his eyes widened in surprise as he realized something. Next to the magical barrier, there were some tubes. His attention focused on them. Those were holes made for air circulation. The entrance was small, but our boy had to try to get in. Sinclair turned around and couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. All the students were talking among themselves about the situation. She began touching her cheek with her finger, and her mind filled with confusion, since she didn't know why there was so much commotion. She thought someone had defeated their team and set a new record. At that moment, someone with 4 legs started running, jumped, and passed by her side. Sinclair stepped aside, closed her eyes, and began screaming. She panicked without knowing what was happening. Due to the impact, she fell on her butt to the ground. The attention of others was fixed on the small animal. Everyone was somewhat surprised and in shock. Sinclair began to turn around and saw a small dog running with some pants in its mouth. With a confused gaze, she couldn't help but wonder where this little dog had come from. In the magical control room, someone forcefully hit the magic stone. Upon seeing this, the teachers couldn't help but go into shock and their eyes filled with surprise. It was Dollars. She drew the sword and began to strike the magic stone with force in a desperate attempt to break it. Just before she could continue, the professors grabbed her by the arms. With a worried expression, one of them asked her what she was doing. The other mentioned that the magic stone was something very ancient, extremely rare and expensive. The lurid eyes were shining with determination. She didn't care about this since they had to cut off the magical energy supply and save the students. If she broke the magic stone, not only would she end up being expelled, but also the Quavati's family would have to pay compensation. She started staring intently at the magic stone, clenched her teeth tightly and asked Tudor and everyone else to hold on, because somehow she was going to help them. Inside the stadium, a mud ant lunged at poor Piggy, who couldn't help but panic. Just before he could defend himself, the beast attacked, causing Piggy to open his mouth and lose consciousness. His body fell several meters back, hitting the ground hard. Tudor and Bianca turned around and couldn't help but panic and feel worried about him, not knowing if he was okay or not. He lost consciousness, and the poisonous gas began to approach his body. In a desperate attempt, Tudor and the others started asking him to get up. They decided to go help Piggy, but just then, a giant ant appeared. Everyone's attention was fixed on it. Sancho and Bianca couldn't help but feel fear, while on the other hand, Tudor stood firm and his eyes began to shine with determination. He hadn't become a hero yet and didn't want to die in vain. The giant ant started staring at them with a murderous gaze and began releasing poisonous. Tudor and the others were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. A beast attacked Sancho and Tudor. Upon seeing this, Bianca panicked, her eyes filled with tears and fear. She couldn't believe that her life was going to end like this. The ant prepared to attack and finish her off. Bianca closed her eyes and clenched her teeth, ready to face the cruel fate. But at that moment, someone with shining eyes began to emerge from the poisonous gas, and just before the beast could attack, someone struck forcefully, shattering its head into pieces. The attack was so powerful that the body of the beast was sent flying backward at great speed. Several seconds passed, and seeing that nothing had happened, Bianca began to open her eyes, not knowing if she was in heaven or not. The poisonous gas started to take effect, making her feel dizzy. She fell to the ground, and the last thing she saw was our boy standing in front of her. Vikar's eyes began to shine, and his gaze fixed on the beast's. He clenched his fist and started releasing a powerful red mana, asking Bianca to rest as he would make sure nothing happened to them. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, in the magical control room, several men grabbed Dollars by the arms to prevent her from continuing to hit the magical crystal. Her eyes were shining with rage as she wanted to break this thing at all costs, to save the students. One of the men explained that if she didn't stop, the magical crystal was going to break. Consumed by despair, she ordered them to let her go since she wanted to save her friends. She prepared herself to attack again, and the men held her more tightly. Behind them was another man holding a tablet which was projecting the map of the stadium. The man began observing in silence and couldn't help but fall into shock. Just before the Saintess could continue, the man revealed to everyone that an additional life reaction had been detected inside the stadium. Upon hearing this, Dollars and the others' eyes widened in surprise, causing them to turn toward the man. Everyone was in shock as they couldn't believe someone had managed to enter the stadium despite the virtual barrier. The bald man wearing glasses and the long-haired man with a mustache began observing the map and couldn't help but be left speechless. With a surprised expression, the bald man realized that someone had broken into the arena and killed a mud ant. The eyes of the man with a mustache were full of confusion, since he could not believe that someone had managed to cross the virtual magic barrier. The tablet was projecting in real time what was happening inside the stadium. On the map there were several red dots and many green dots. The reality was that no one knew what was going on inside. The scene changed, and inside the stadium, Piggy's and Bianca's unconscious bodies were on the ground, and the area was filled with poisonous gas. Before there wasn't any problem. But now that they no longer had HP points, the gas could be deadly if the ants weren't defeated. Not far away were also the unconscious bodies of Sancho and Tudor, and in front of everyone stood Vikir. He clenched his fist and with a determined expression began to stare intently at the ants. Just then his eyes filled with alertness and he turned around. Behind him was the small spider hidden under the corpse of one of the ants. Vikir noticed the presence of the spider, but instead of turning back, he did not move and mentioned that according to the family motto, the fate of an untamable beast was only death. Despite the fact that the little spider was just a baby, she understood what was about to happen now and couldn't help but feel fear, realizing that she had made a mistake by entering the stadium in search of food. Vikir's eyes began to shine intensely. He turned towards the little spider and decided to give her a lecture later, and gave her the order to devour all the poison around to protect others. With a grateful expression, she placed her paw on her forehead, indicating that she was ready to obey his order. She opened her mouth and began inhaling all the poisonous gas in the area. While Vikyr was distracted, one of the giant ants appeared above him and started staring at him intently. But our boy didn't take long to sense its presence. He clenched his fist and with a serene gaze asked the beast if it didn't have even a bit of shame. In response, the ant opened its mouth and prepared to attack. But as usual, just before the beast could even make a move, Vikyr moved at great speed, activated his mana, and without much effort, struck the beast on the neck using his leg, separating its head from its body. In the magical control room, the bald man and the others were in shock. The other man began observing the map closely and couldn't help but feel confused upon seeing that there was suddenly a vital reaction. Vikyr's attention focused on the ant's corpse, and his eyes filled with concern. He didn't remember that in this place one could sense vital energy. Meanwhile, the small spider was devouring all of the poisonous gas. He placed his hand on the ground and adopted an offensive stance, considering that he was 18 years old and an intermediate beginner-level sword expert. If his level as a graduate were discovered, it would cause a great commotion. In front of him were two powerful killer ants, which were soldier ants, specialists in fighting. One of them had a risk level of B claw, and the other had a C. Vikyr began to observe the ants carefully, realizing that these fictitious golems had been made to look exactly like real monsters. Not far from him was Sancho unconscious on the ground. Vikyr approached him and grabbed his axe firmly. Then he picked up all the others' weapons. Now he carried Bianca's bow, Tudor's spear, and Piggy's sword on his back. His eyes were full of determination. He began to stare intently at the ants and came to the conclusion that if he used the strategy of the killer ants he had known in his previous life, he would be able to face them as if he were an advanced sword expert. His gaze fixed on the ant's neck. The weak point of these beasts was the dorsal cover, which was the connection between the head and thorax. Just before the ants could attack, Vikyr wrapped Sancho's axe with mana and hurled it forcefully toward the ant. The axe began spinning at great speed and struck hard against the beast's dorsal cover, causing it terrible pain. Barboy began to gaze at the ground and remembered that in this part was located the biometric compass of the killer ants. Upon witnessing Vikyr's terrible power, the ants couldn't help but feel fear, and their bodies began to tremble. Vikyr moved at great speed, and using Sancho's axe he attacked 3 of the ants again on their dorsal cover. The reality was that if it broke, they lost their sense of direction and started walking backward. He drew Bianca's bow, began aiming at the ants, and his eyes started to shine with a penetrating aura. He remembered that these beasts still had one more weakness. His attention focused on the ants' skulls. The skull was divided into 2 pieces, with a small length the size of a finger located in the lower central part. He wrapped the arrow with mana and shot it. The arrow flew like thunder and struck the ants' skull, shattering it into pieces. The shell in that area was considerably less hard than in other places. Vikyr drew Tudor's spear, jumped, and appeared above the ants he had incapacitated earlier with the axe. The ants raised their heads, started looking up, and upon seeing him, they couldn't help but panic. Vikyr moved like lightning and first struck the beast's skulls, then attacked their necks, and finally cut off their legs. After attacking, he descended back to the ground, placed one hand on it, and began staring intently at the other beasts, ready to finish them all. But then something happened, and his eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. A shadow much larger than that of the other ants appeared above him. Vikyr stood up and his attention was fixed on it. Despite being in front of the beast, he remained calm and began to observe with a curious gaze. A giant red ant appeared, its attention fixed on our boy, and its mouth watered. This was another one of the killer ants, more precisely a general ant, with a risk level of rank A. Upon seeing this, our boy dropped the spear to the ground and his attention was fixed on it. He was somewhat surprised to see that this monster was also in the exam. His eyes filled with emotion, causing a smile to appear on his face. He grabbed the hilt of Piggy's sword and slowly began to unsheath it. The curtain of poisonous gas had spread throughout the magical virtual barrier, making it impossible for the spectators to see what was happening inside. Everyone was silent, not knowing what was going on. All the students began discussing among themselves. Now nothing could be seen due to the poisonous fog. The time for the third pattern was already running out, and there was no way that first-year students could withstand the 3 patterns that even third-year students couldn't endure. In the magical control room, one of the men who was monitoring the stadium went into shock. Seeing this, the man with a mustache turned toward him and, with a curious and fearful expression, asked what the problem was. The bald man began sweating like crazy, not knowing what was happening or what to do now. The man turned around and, with an expression full of panic, revealed that the general ant had been defeated. Moreover, the vital signs of those being examined were still normal. Professor Morgi appeared, and his eyes widened in confusion. No one could believe that the powerful general ant had been defeated. Morgi began to recall one of the general ants, and his eyes filled with fear, because this beast was not a golem that academy students were supposed to defeat. It was a cheat that had been placed to make it difficult for students to last easily for an hour. He put his hand under his chin and with a curious gaze began to wonder what was happening inside the stadium. Just then, a man carrying a woman with purple hair on his shoulders appeared. He started shouting, informing that he had found Professor Sadie, who had the key to the magical wall B. One of the superiors asked where she had been. The man panicked and with a nervous gaze replied that she had come here after the owner of a bar in an alley reported her for vandalism and interference with business. Professor Sadie was completely drunk and drooling. She was unable to stand on her feet. In conclusion, she was crazy. Dollars turned towards them, clenched her fist, began to point towards the magic barrier with her finger, and with a furious gaze gave them the order to open the magical wall B. Upon hearing this, the eyes of the others were full of concern as no one knew if Tudor and the others were still alive or not. They used the key and little by little the magic barrier began to disintegrate, releasing the poisonous gas to the outside. The incident that occurred during the Academy's midterm exam ultimately ended with the release of the magical wall after 42 minutes and 13 seconds. The instructors, who were panting heavily, descended to the stadium. The eyes of everyone were full of surprise and confusion. In front of them were the corpses of the ants lying on the ground. They could not believe that some first-year students had defeated all these ants. Just then, Dollars, who was very worried, also descended to the stadium and with a gaze full of concern started running, asking where Tudor and the others were. Her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't help but be left open-mouthed. In front of her was Vikir's unconscious body lying on the ground, surrounded by the corpses of ants. Her attention fixed on our boy, she began to observe him in silence, not knowing what was happening. We don't know if Vikir was really unconscious or just pretending. A question came to Dollars' mind. She didn't know what he was doing here. Well, the reality was that Vikir was pretending. He closed his eyes to appear even more so, and although it was somewhat uncomfortable, it was better to pretend that he had fallen while fighting with the boys. Dollars was somewhat surprised, but she couldn't help feeling somewhat relieved, and despite this being a little complicated to understand, she was satisfied with not having lost any great future hero. Her friend appeared with a camera in hand. She started smiling, ready to take pictures and publish everything in the newspaper. She turned on the camera and carefully took a photo of Vikir, who was lying on the ground. He was known as a hero who had jumped into danger to save his classmates during the midterm exam at Colosio Academy. The photograph of Tudor, Bianca, Piggy and Sancho was also made public in the newspaper. Bianca revealed the heroic feats of Vikir that she had seen before fainting. After that, Vikir was interviewed. He began to touch his chin with his finger, and with a confused gaze, mentioned that this was the result created by combining the power of his friends and himself. He was a humble hero and was flooded with praise. A photo of Vikir wiping sweat after a match was also published. He became a topic of conversation for being handsome and was reevaluated in his mana rank as a high-level expert swordsman. The head of the Monster Research Center raised suspicion, saying it was impossible for a high-level expert swordsman to defeat an ant general. But Vikir explained that he knew killer ants had a vital point in their skulls. The very prince summoned Vikir, and because he had revealed the secret behind the killer ants, it was predicted that the mortality rate of imperial soldiers would decrease, and as a result, the crown prince awarded our boy a certificate. His expression showed that he did not want to be in this place. Vikir was named this year's hot star, but he wasn't very sure about it. Someone who was reading the newspaper tore it into pieces with their hands. It was nighttime, and this person was none other than Vikir. He was sitting on top of the academy roof, and while the moon illuminated the area, he began to gaze at the ground with a lost look and sigh. His eyes were full of concern, since no one would have thought that his quiet student life would end up becoming so problematic. The baby madam appeared. She closed her eyes and with a smile began to jump for joy. But our boy told her that this was not something she should be celebrating. Despite the fact that everything had changed, he was happy that the others were out of danger. While he was distracted, an owl started flying toward them. Vikir couldn't help but feel tense and confused, while on the other hand, the baby madam got scared. Quickly, the little spider hid in Vikir's clothes. He extended his arm and the owl perched on it. His attention focused on the owl's leg, which had a note rolled around it. Our boy quickly realized it was Cindy Wendy's regular report. He took the note and began to read carefully. She had acquired the vital training of the 10 elite corpses, but she needed time to analyze, at most a month. Regarding the Night Hound, imitators had appeared. One did it for glorification, and the intentions of the others were unknown. Osiris of the Baskerville family was far from the estate, and it was assumed that he was heading to the imperial capital. And last but not least, one of the first-year students at the academy was hiding their royal lineage. After delivering the message, the owl started flying away. Little baby madam re-emerged from our boy's clothing. Our boy's gaze fixed on the paper and his eyes widened with curiosity. He didn't know if she had found clues about the 10 elite corpses. Seeing that she was asking him to wait a month made it evident that she was approaching this matter cautiously. He began to remember when he had defeated the demon alongside Saintess Dollars. Better than anyone, he knew that he had defeated it easily thanks to borrowing the power of the Saintess, but during the next month, he needed to diligently improve his skills. With a worried expression, he started imagining the Night Bloodhound. He was concerned about the matter of the Night Bloodhound before, but now there were imitators, and it would be bad if they drew attention from the palace or if their actions overlapped. He needed to investigate this as soon as possible. As for other news, his brother Osiris Le Baskerville, who had a piercing gaze, had left the family estate. Additionally, there was a member of royalty at the academy. While little baby madam was hiding inside Vikar's neck, he began to imagine Cindy Wendy giving a thumbs up with a smile. He hadn't asked her to do the fourth thing, so he didn't know why she had told him this. To him, she was a somewhat strange woman. To prevent the information from being revealed, using his hand, he burned the sheet. He didn't care about knowing it, since it wasn't as if he were losing anything by knowing it. In the blink of an eye, the sheet turned to ashes and began flying with the wind. The wind directed the ashes to one side, and at that moment, a woman wearing a skirt appeared. She couldn't believe she had met the hero of the academy in a place like this. Upon hearing her voice, Vikar came out of his trance and fixed his attention on her. It was none other than Sinclair. While the sky was filled with stars, she began to show a smile. She closed her eyes and blushingly asked if this was what they called destiny. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, Sinclair, somewhat nervous, sat on the roof and with a smile began to enjoy the view. She was someone who had been evaluated for her sincerity and talent. A talented person who had maintained the top position in the Fire Corps with an overwhelming performance. Vikar did not lower his guard and with a suspicious expression, began to observe her closely. Not knowing what she was doing here at this hour of the night. The sky was beautiful and filled with stars. Sinclair decided to break the tension. He was somewhat surprised to find Vikar here at this time. This was her special place where she came to see the Milky Way when she felt depressed. The expression of our boy changed. He was speechless as he had misunderstood the situation. Sinclair turned her head towards him and her eyes filled with love, making her blush like a tomato. She hoped to find Vikar here again if she came to this place in the future. Vikar felt her gaze and with a worried expression, began to stare at the ground. He knew it was better to change the place where he received messages from Cindy Wendy. With a kind smile, she extended her hand, revealing that lately at the academy everyone was talking about him. Vikar didn't even lift his head, and with a cold gaze responded that this was something he didn't want to know about. But she commented that there was no reason to feel embarrassed since there was always public interest in extraordinary people. With a somewhat amused expression, she began counting on her fingers, revealing that if being number one wasn't enough, there were also 3 research articles that were going to revolutionize the academic world. He was an irregular of plebeian origin but whose aura was at the level of an expert. Vikar's eyes widened with concern, making him sweat. Sinclair also commented that in many ways, he was someone who intimidated his peers. Our boy sighed and revealed that grades were nothing more than something useless, so he advised her not to worry too much about them. Sinclair tilted her head to one side and her mind filled with confusion. She couldn't believe that grades didn't matter in an academy. Vikar was more aware than anyone that money, power, honor would soon become useless things. When the era of destruction began, all existing order would collapse, giving rise to an era where the only thing that mattered was survival. With a smile, she admitted that Vikar spoke as if he had lived a long time and seemed like an old man. This sparked curiosity in our boy. He was somewhat surprised to see this, according to him. She was somewhat intelligent. Sinclair decided to change the subject and with a curious gaze asked what Vikar was going to do after midterms. In response, he started showing one finger and with a confident expression mentioned that he was going to train his back and lower body. She was somewhat confused, asking if he had just hit his head. She closed her eyes and sighed, while on the other side, our boy adjusted his glasses with his fingers. He remembered that she was also someone who hid many things just like him. Before returning, she had graduated as the top of her class without ever losing first place despite being of plebeian origin. And not long after she disappeared from history, cutting off contact with everyone and no one heard from her again. While the moonlight was illuminating everything, little by little Sinclair began to open her eyes and a smile appeared on her face. It was strange that she was of plebeian origin, and Vikar didn't know if she could be a member of royalty disguised as a plebeian and hiding her identity, remembering that Cindy Windy had mentioned that a member of royalty had entered the academy. The next day, the sun emerged at the academy. Tudor, who had just gotten up, began to stretch his arms and let out a sigh of exhaustion since he never thought the exam period would be so long. They put on their backpacks and started walking toward the academy with a smile. Tudor, who was stretching his arms, explained that with the attack test taking place today, midterm exams would come to an end. Sancho, who was walking beside him, turned around and with a serious gaze reminded everyone that due injuries they had suffered in the accident during the defense exam. The exam schedule had been postponed, making it inevitable for the period to become longer. Vikar and Piggy, who were in front, kept walking in silence. Tudor's eyes were full of hatred. He began to imagine the bastard Grandwell. It was a bit disappointing that the bet with that guy had ended in a tie. He started massaging his shoulder, and his attention focused on one of them. With a cheerful and confident expression, he said that this time he had realized who was going to be his rival. For him, the exam had been a great test. Our boy was somewhat confused, not knowing what was happening. Thanks to Vikar, they had gotten hurt less, but it was annoying that he was hiding his abilities. He was an expert of superior level who had been concealing his true power from his friends. Vikar turned his back on them. The 3 clenched their fists and gave him a soft punch as punishment. Vikar turned his head, and with a serious expression mentioned that they didn't remember, but he hadn't done it alone. Tudor extended his hands, closed his eyes, and replied that Vikar was very humble. They decided to change the subject, and Tudor asked if they had heard that the Night-Blood Hound had committed another terrorist act. Vikar's eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. Piggy opened the backpack and took out a newspaper. With a calm gaze, he revealed that this time the students from Varangian's training center had been hurt by the Night-Blood Hound. Vikar and Sancho's attention was fixed on him. Both remained silently staring. Piggy opened the newspaper, and his eyes widened with seriousness. It was said that damage had occurred during the process in which the students had discovered and restrained the Night-Blood Hound. According to the latest news, the Night-Blood Hound had committed endless evil actions. He was the worst villain of all time. He had shown his fangs once again, early last night. Students from Varangian's training center who had come on an excursion to the Yellow Sea were attacked by the night blood hound. Suffering great damage, 10 people were slightly injured, and 10 people were seriously injured, among them being the head of Varangian's training center. They started talking among themselves. Sancho crossed his arms and asked if the scope of activity of the night bloodhound was not being expanded. Piggy, who was reading the newspaper, mentioned that nowadays there were people who supported someone like him. Tudor put his hand under his chin and couldn't help but wonder what the purpose of that guy was. Vikar began to gaze at the ground with a lost expression and clenched his fist, realizing that his imitators had set things in motion. His eyes filled with rage. There were 2 imitators. One of them seemed to have become less active recently, while the other had been gradually increasing their activity. Everyone set off towards the academy. Sancho, Tudor, and Piggy were happy, while on the other hand, Vikar was tense. The problem was that surveillance against the night bloodhound had become stricter, and if things continued like this, a future assassination could also be thwarted. It was early in the morning and all the students were entering the academy. Vikar decided that once the exam ended, he would get rid of the imitators. Somewhere in the academy was the area where attack exams were conducted. Unlike the defense exam, which required teamwork and was carried out in groups of 4, the attack exam was a test where individual skill was most important. It was a 1-to-1 combat between professor versus student, where they would fight against the golems controlled by the professors, and one would earn points for valid hits, evasion, etc. When the professor summoned a golem, it was Sancho's turn. He imbued his mana into the spear and attacked with force, striking hard against the barrier. By fighting against golems that mimicked the movements of professors who were masters of combat, the goal was for students to gain practical experience against strong opponents. Behind the golem stood Professor Morgi, who crossed his arms in front of his chest while controlling the golem. The fatal flaw of the exam was that the number of students a professor could teach was limited to 50. Tudor clenched his teeth and his eyes filled with determination. Using all his strength, he attacked the golem, breaking it into pieces. The criteria for evaluating the students' tests changed depending on the fighting style of the professor in charge. He was very exhausted and began to stare at the golem, somewhat surprised to see that his attack had worked. Professor Morgi's eyes were full of seriousness. He began to stare silently at Tudor, creating tension. He revealed that there was still a long way to go. At that moment, several green roots emerged from the ground, causing Tudor to tense up. The roots were fake, and while Tudor was distracted, the professor's golem appeared in front of him and prepared to strike with its fist. He gripped the spear tightly and soon realized that its speed had increased, not knowing if the professor had physically strengthened the golem. As the fist was slowly approaching, Tudor put his arms in front of his face to defend himself, but the reality was that the fist was also a feint. Now that Tudor had let his guard down, the golem launched a powerful kick, which landed squarely against his ribs, causing his eyes to fill with fear. Tudor's eyes turned white. He opened his mouth and began screaming in pain and shortly after collapsed on the ground, writhing in agony. The golem stood before him, and the professor mentioned that he shouldn't have thought he couldn't use fists and feet just because he was a mage. The golem gave Tudor a hand and helped him to stand up. The only purpose of a fight was victory. He had to remember that. Even as a mage, one must use their fists, feet, and teeth to win. Tudor thanked the professor. The total points were calculated, and all the students went to the stadium and Tudor, who was somewhat exhausted, sat down. From Ice Corps Class A Cadet Tudor Lamanchadon Quijot, evaluated by Professor Venci Mork, managed to land 12 attacks, execute 20 dodges, block 3 attacks, and score 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 35 points. Bianca was in shock and somewhat confused. She extended her hand, unable to believe that Tudor had defeated her. From Ice Corps Class A Cadet Bank, evaluated by Professor Venci Mork, managed to land 7 attacks, execute 24 dodges, block 0 attacks, and score 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 31 points. She became furious, stood up, and while pointing at Tudor with her finger explained that all of this was the fault of how this test was set up. A one-on-one combat was disadvantageous for an archer. Tudor, who was sitting, turned towards her and with a confused expression responded that He didn't remember anything about fairness when she had taken all the individual points during the defense exam. While they were arguing, someone started laughing, and upon hearing this, their attention turned to the back. It was Granwell. While he had one hand resting on the seat, he extended the other and with a smile mocked them, revealing that this made it clear that he was the best of the two. From Ice Corps Class A, Cadet Granwell, evaluated by Professor Vency Mork, managed to land 11 attacks, execute 22 dodges, block 2 attacks, and receive 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 35 points. With a confused gaze, Tutor asked what he was talking about, letting him know that both had obtained the same score. Granwell got angry, started pointing at him with his finger, and with a furious expression mentioned that they both had the same score in both the defense exam and in the attack exam. His eyes began to shine with joy, and with an evil smile, he said that this was his victory, since his theoretical grade was higher than his. Upon hearing this, Tutor couldn't help but go into shock and feel desperate. He became depressed upon seeing that he had lost against Granwell. Bianca, who was sitting next to him, placed her hand on his back to console him, explaining that they were lucky because their teacher was Vency Mork. She began touching her chin and, with a calm expression, revealed that the others had Professor Sadie. Tutor's expression changed, and his eyes widened with curiosity. He began to imagine Professor Sadie smiling like a lunatic. Bianca couldn't help but feel fear and disgust, since she was a pathetic and drunken teacher who had disappeared with the Beaky of the magic wall. The older ones described her as strange and unprofessional. She was the #1 teacher students avoided. Tutor started looking at her and couldn't help but be somewhat confused. He panicked and asked how someone like her had become a professor at the academy. Bianca moved her hand away from her chin and with an insecure gaze mentioned that she was very skilled, so when she wasn't working as a teacher, she helped authorities catch criminals. She began to imagine the Night Bloodhound with the Beelzebub sword, revealing that she was in charge of helping capture criminals like the Night Bloodhound. Tutor's eyes filled with seriousness and concern. He knew that his friends were strong, so he thought they were going to be fine. Bianca placed both hands on the seat and began to observe the sky, revealing that this was the reason why she was also worried. With a lost gaze, she revealed that Professor Sadie was the last relative of a fallen marquis, and felt envy towards talented students who came from a good family. And the problem was that because of her envy, there was a rumor saying that she completely destroyed talented students. At the same time, somewhere in the academy, Piggy's body was lying on the ground and covered in blood. A woman wearing heels placed her foot on top of his head. A golem that had the same appearance as the woman stepped forward, creating tension. In front of her were several students. They were in shock and very scared to see that another student had fainted. They could not believe this was truly a test. The door of the room closed, and the students started banging on it to try to open it. They wanted to leave this place and take the exam with another teacher. Professor Sadie, who had her hand resting on her hip, began touching her lip. She was stepping on Piggy's head, who was unconscious on the floor. To her, this year's students were all cowards. Cadet Piggy from the ICE Corps Class B had been evaluated by Professor Sadie. She managed to score 0 attacks landed, 0 dodges executed, 0 blocked attacks, and 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 0 points. Next to her was Sinclair's unconscious body. Covered in blood, she managed to land 0 attacks, execute 0 dodges, block 0 attacks, and achieve 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 0 points. Not far away was also Sancho's body. Covered in blood, he managed to land 0 attacks, execute 0 dodges, block 0 attacks, and achieve 0 critical hits, obtaining a total of 0 points. Sadie pulled out a whip. She began observing the students and thought that continuing with this was a waste of time. All the students had fled except for one who stood up ready to take the exam. It was none other than Vikier. He started staring at her with a piercing gaze. Professor Sadie placed her hand on her cheek, stuck out her tongue, and with an expression thirsty for blood gave our boy the order to approach her. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, Snake had his hands splattered with blood. Several minutes passed and Snake did not move. And just then, a fly that was wandering around the area approached him. Several flies began to fly in circles around Snake's corpse. The spell to resurrect was so powerful that Snake had lost his life trying to deactivate it. Now on the ground there was a crater, and in the middle was the body of Camus Morgue and the corpse of Snake. The eyes of Camus Morgue, who was bleeding from her mouth, were filled with exhaustion. She did not know how much time had passed, and her burned body did not move. She was lying on the floor, and the floor was full of blood. She better than anyone knew that this was the price one had to pay for using a forbidden spell to bring back the dead. They were on the 666th floor of the Hall of Darkness, and the only thing that could be seen from below was a small light. So no one was going to come to this space hidden deep within the Hall of Darkness. She accepted that she was going to die in this place, and although her master, who had died in her place, would find this ridiculous, she had already tried everything and no longer had the will to live. She began to remember the last time she had seen Vikir in the forest. Our boy turned his back on her and prepared to draw his sword. If there was something she regretted, it was that in the end she never got to meet him. She closed her eyes, thinking that maybe by dying she would finally be able to meet Vikir. Someone mentioned that she seemed to want to live. Upon hearing this, with the little strength she had left, with an exhausted gaze, Camus Morgue opened her eyes and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. Her attention was fixed on Snake's corpse lying beside her in a tired tone. She couldn't help but wonder why she was hearing a voice, and whether she might be hallucinating. The voice began to sound again, revealing that it wasn't a hallucination. They had come here after feeling her longing. Camus Morgue, who didn't even have the strength to move, asked if they were a demon like the ones she read about in books. The voice confirmed her theory. Realizing that she seemed to know about demons, the demon decided to get to the point. They could save her with their power, asking if she wanted to make a contract with them. Camus Morgue, who was losing more and more blood, refused since she had no attachment to life. Upon hearing this, the demon became curious and asked what it was that she desired. Camus Morgue began to think in silence, not knowing what to say. The demon's attention fixed on the shattered ground, and they soon realized that Camus Morgue had tried to use the magic circle to resurrect someone. The demon asked if there was a dead person she wanted to see. A demonic smile appeared, and the demon revealed that this was her specialization, since after all she was the demon of indulgence and corruption named Ser. She decided to help Camus Morgue meet the person she wanted to bring back to life, asking her to make a contract with her. The eyes of Camus Morgue slowly began to open and shine with a light of hope. She began to observe the demon and ponder in silence. She remembered Snake's words before dying. He had pushed her into the water, saying that he hoped she could reunite with her loved one. Camus Morgue closed her eyes, not knowing what to do with the little strength she had left. She accepted and decided to make a contract with the demon. Upon hearing this, an excited smile spread across the demon's face. Camus Morgue opened her eyes, which began to shine with determination. She had thought that she had tried everything, but if there was still a path left, she couldn't give up. It was night, and the moon was shining high in the sky, and on the outskirts of the city stood the castle of the Morgue family. Camus arrived at the castle, and seeing that she had returned, the guards decided to help her enter. With a worried gaze, Adolphe, who was panting heavily, and several guards approached the entrance of the castle. Camus Morgue, who had recovered from her wounds, entered the castle and began to walk down the hallway. Adolphe's attention was fixed on her, and upon seeing that she had returned, he froze and asked if she knew how worried he had been about her. Now Camus's hair color had changed. With a sad gaze, she began to look at the ground, not knowing what to say. Adolphe's gaze was fixed on her hair, and his eyes widened in confusion. He wanted to know what had happened to her hair, and what she had been doing during the last 10 days, believing that that bastard Snake must be behind it all. With a cold expression, Camus Morgue walked past her uncle without saying a single word. Seeing this, Adolphe's eyes widened in confusion and his jaw dropped in surprise. Camus Morgue clenched her fists, began to walk away from her uncle, and with a sincere expression apologized, saying that she was tired. Adolf and the guards turned around and their attention focused on her. Everyone was somewhat surprised, not knowing what was happening. The demon, Sayer, manifested herself and couldn't help but smile and feel pity, asking if it was okay to ignore an uncle she hadn't seen in a long time. Camus Morgue's eyes began to shine with determination. With a furious gaze, she gave the order to the demon to shut up. She began to walk down the hallway, which had a beautiful ceiling lamp. She made it clear that if the demon did not demonstrate her usefulness, she was going to break their contract. The demon decided to show her powers. That was how her contract with Sayer began. The demon, Sayer, was going to grant a portion of her power to Camus Morgue and was going to help her reunite with Vicar van Baskerville as payment. Camus Morgue would have to grant Sayer full control of her body for 1 hour each day, remaining completely unconscious during this period. Additionally, Camus Morgue was forbidden from saying anything related to Sayer and demons. After that day, she met with the demon Sayer in the forest, where she extended her hand and began using her powers, making evil energy emerge. There were 2 abilities that Camus Morgue obtained from Sayer. Camus Morgue, who was holding a lock of hair, opened her palm and let it fall to the ground. Then she extended her hands and, using her powers, began to revive a dead person. Sayer crossed his arms and with a smile began to watch in silence. Thanks to the power of the demon, she had the ability to find what she wanted and the ability to revive a corpse. Several seconds later, she managed to successfully revive someone who had red hair. Camus Morgue clasped her hands and her eyes filled with tears and astonishment. She had revived Rose without losing a second. She threw herself and gave her a hug. Camus Morgue had been able to find her cousin who had died at the hands of the barbarians. After a few days, they returned to the Hall of Darkness. Using some candles and drawing a magic circle on the ground, Sayer began to fly and control several spirits. Her eyes widened in confusion and surprise since it was the first time that she experienced something like that, revealing that she could not feel at all Vicar's soul whom Camus Morgue was looking for. Camus Morgue, who was standing behind, began to gaze toward the ground. Then her eyes began to shine with determination since she could not give up. During the day, she used clothes training as an excuse to take care of Rose, and during the night, she moved around to search for Vicar. Her mother and uncle showed no objection and did not inquire much into the matter either. She entered her room and using a pen began to draw a magic circle. Over time, she began to grow distant from her mother, her uncle, and the people of the clan since she had no time to think about them. To find Vicar, she had no time to think about anything else. One day while she was in the Hall of Darkness, someone started laughing. Her eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Behind her stood someone wearing an elegant suit. With a furious gaze, she turned around and asked how they had gotten in here. It was a demon who began to smile and said that his business was not with her. Dantelion's eyes began to shine with evil and a smile spread across his face, revealing his true form. He extended his hand and with a penetrating gaze gave the order to Camus Morgue to bring Sayer, and that is how after that day Rose disappeared. While Sayer's eyes were shining with evil, with a smile she explained to Camus Morgue that her ally, the 9th Corpse, said he needed a servant, and had taken Rose, revealing that once this guy disappeared, it was hard to find him again. Dantelion, an ally of Sayer and a demon, took Rose and disappeared. Camus Morgue became furious, extended her hand, and asked how Sayer had let Dantelion take her cousin. Sayer extended her hands, turned to her, and with a smile explained that Rose was dead. She could fix her again, so she asked Camus Morgue not to get angry. The eyes of Camus Morgue began to shine with rage. She clenched her fist, and it didn't take long for her to realize that deep down, she was a demon. And the day she went looking for Rose, she reached the dormitories of the orphanage, where Vicar had defeated the demon Dantelion. It was night and the building was cut in half. When she revived Rose, someone appeared. Camus Morg's eyes widened with curiosity, and she turned around. It was Vikar. With a piercing gaze, our boy drew his bow and prepared to launch a mana arrow. Back in the present, the wind began to blow, moving strands of Camus Morg's hair. Our boy mentioned that some time had passed. Upon seeing Vikar, she fell to her knees on the ground and her eyes filled with tears and sadness. Vikar had taken off his mask, and she began to observe our boy through the gap in the wall of skeletons in silence. With a cheerful expression and a smile, Vikar realized that she had changed a lot since the last time he saw her. Seeing that Vikar was alive, Camus Morgu's eyes widened in surprise, and she couldn't help but cry and was about to let out all the things she wanted to ask him. Vikar moved away from the wall of skeletons and began to walk toward her. Camus Morg began to gaze at the ground without knowing why Vikar was saying things so calmly when so much time had passed since they last saw each other, nor why he hadn't come looking for her if he was alive. Vikar didn't know how hard it had been for her, nor how much she had fought to be able to see him again. While our boy was getting closer to her, Camus Morg couldn't help but freeze and didn't say a single word. Vikar stopped in front of her, realizing that she had made a contract with a demon. He wanted to know what had happened. She didn't say a single word since she wanted Vikar to see her as a cool woman in her final moments, even without asking. She could feel that the depth of Vikar's eyes had never looked so deep before. He had become someone so handsome, unlike her, who had ruined everything. Vikar's eyes filled with confusion. With a surprised expression, he called Camus Morgu's attention. She lifted her head and began to observe our boy in silence. Her time was going to end soon, and when that happened, Vikar would have to fight against Sayer. The last thing Camus Morg could do for Vikar was not let him fight alone again. But now that she had been able to see him again, from the bottom of her heart, she thanked our boy for having recognized and found her. Upon hearing this, Vikar's eyes widened in fear and confusion. A magic circle appeared beneath Camus Morgi, and then spikes began to emerge from it. With eyes full of tears and happiness, she gave Vikar 100 points out of 100. The spikes shot toward her. Camus Morg closed her eyes and with a smile admitted that she was happy. At that moment, a pool of blood appeared on the ground, and splashes of blood fell on Camus Morgu's face, making her eyes fill with surprise, leaving her in shock. Just before the spikes could hurt her, Vikar gave her a hug, taking the spikes directly. With a confused and fearful gaze, she asked why Vikar had done this. The spikes had pierced Vikar's back with a calm tone. He explained that he understood that she couldn't tell him because of the contract she had with the demon. Vikar hugged her tightly since she hadn't managed to land any critical blow when they fought. Camus Morgi began to cry without knowing why he was doing this again. Vikar began to gaze at the ground, saying that if ending her life had been a way of telling him that she couldn't talk about it, then she shouldn't worry about him. He asked her to let him take care of it. Vikar's eyes began to shine with hatred, as he was never going to lose against a demon. The demon Sayer took control of Camus Morgu's body, and while her eyes were shining, a smile spread across her face. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,